and also to please keep wearing your masks. We still have COVID around, so may I request those who do not have a mask, please ask for one from our ushers, and we will provide you one, but please wear your masks. Thank you. Please be seated. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Policy Dialogue on Rethinking Solutions towards Inclusive, Green and Equitable Recovery for India and the region, organized by UNDP. India's challenges are not distinct from those of the region, and amongst others, the country is faced with a high degree of informality in the economy, social and spatial inequalities, and high vulnerabilities to climate change. Climatic trends in India are intersecting with development gains in ways that have often increased the socioeconomic risks and vulnerabilities of individuals and communities. Yet, despite its issues, India remains a key player in the Asia-Pacific region and will play a defining role in its future trajectory. India must provide and learn from best practices from around the world for a sustainable and inclusive recovery from the pandemic, and it can use its experience in dealing with the pandemic to guide regional recovery. Our proposed dialogue today aims to bring together key policy makers, researchers, and decision makers to discuss the way forward for an inclusive, green, and equitable recovery. It will, we hope, discuss some of the emerging priorities in the context of India, whose success or struggles in tackling these challenges can determine the direction the region will take. The focus of the event will be on three key themes: sustainable economic revival, which sectors and regions will drive growth in India and the region, and for India, what are the pathways to transition from a largely informal labor force? What priorities can ensure this growth is sustainable and will enable the region to respond to the pressing challenges of climate change? The other theme is inequality and social protection. The pandemic reaffirmed for us the importance of a robust social protection architecture, and what are the lessons that India can experience, especially in the context of strengthening state capability and digitization. Policy and governance is the third theme. Will policies and initiatives implemented at the national and subnational levels in the context of recovery from COVID-19 have the potential to reverse the negative trends on the SDGs and launch an accelerated progress? Or should a new set of measures be pursued to ensure good governance? What key governance and policy reforms must India prioritize domestically to enable it to play its important role in the region? We have a formidable group of speakers today who will share their valuable views, and we hope to benefit greatly from their insights. I'd like to now request the UN Resident Coordinator in India, Mr. Shombi Sharp, to come up and say a few words. Mr. Sharp has more than 25 years of experience in promoting inclusive and sustainable development internationally. He has most recently served as the UN Resident Coordinator in Armenia and has held several leadership positions at the UNDP previously. I'd like to now invite him to make the opening remarks and welcome all our guests and speakers.
Thank you so much, Bahar. I'm not a shark, trust me. I've been accused of many things. No, I'm joking. It's not the first time. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here on behalf of the broader United Nations team in India, to welcome all of you, to welcome Honorable Sri Sriram Saran, of course, Connie, Vikni Raja, old colleague from previous days and leading the UNDP Regional Bureau for Asia and Pacific. We're very pleased to have her here. Of course, Delhi is a second home, I know, so probably Connie needs no introduction. and Mr. Nageswaran, Chief Economic Advisor, good friends and colleague Shiv Kumar. It's really great to be here. Namaskar. Mujhe aap sab ko milkar bahut acha laga. So, colleagues, I think that it's quite, it seems that we are surrounded by bad news. This is the theme of the day. India, the region, the world is faced with multiple overlapping crises, new ones emerging, it seems, when least expected. Just as we were trying to transition to a rather fragile recovery from the COVID pandemic, suddenly we face new sources of turbulence. The ongoing senseless war in Ukraine, driving not just human tragedy, but skyrocketing inflation, looming food security crisis, energy crisis, carbohydrates, and hydrocarbons, as they say. This is all coming together. Food prices are rising, fertilizer prices are doubling. The impact on everybody, especially the most poor, especially the most vulnerable, is continuing to mount. And it's this confluence, I think, of pandemic, of war, of inflation. All of this is a stark reminder of the interconnectedness, of the non-linearity, of the unpredictability of the world that we live in. And all of this is coming against the backdrop of likely the greatest existential crisis of them all, the relentless triple planetary crisis, a multiplier of disruptions. We need only open the door. We need only just the 3 minutes walk from UN House just across the street here, outdoors in this heat wave, tells you all that you need to know. We've had the hottest 7 years on record, pretty much in the last 7 years. More or less the last 20 years have been the hottest on record. What will the next 20 bring? Here in northern India, we're facing this record-breaking heat wave, causing, we see already, crop production to fall, just as the world needs more. But now the good news. There is a lot of cause for optimism, and a lot of that has to do with India. As much as our challenges are interconnected, so are our solutions. And this is the message of the SDGs, more relevant today than ever. Nowhere has this interconnectedness been more embraced under the rubric of the SDGs than here in India. From village levels, from panchayats to the state to the central level. Incredibly encouraging, and I see so much scope for optimism. I'm inspired by the enthusiasm, by the dynamism for change that I've seen firsthand in my travels to communities across the country in the short half year that I've been here. From joining in the world's largest beach cleanup in Varsava Beach in Mumbai, to hearing the stories of the Kudumbashri in Kerala, to sitting down with communities in the village of Jahota in Rajasthan and hearing about the innovative approaches that the Panchayat Sarpanch is bringing there together with the community. This is all about linking hope and resilience. And of course, we in the UN system are there wherever we can add value as partners, together with our development partners as well. It's no secret that India, with the biggest youth generation in history, has an immense potential of demographic dividend if that can be coupled with inclusive, sustainable growth and on the basis of gender equality, unleashing the full potential of half of the population. The opportunities for digitalization as a source for sustainable green inclusive growth on the back of world-beating technologies, an incredibly robust and growing private sector here in India is enormous. And the government is leading the way, supporting the national tech stack, which is gaining more and more renown globally. India's leadership on climate action, on the triple planetary crisis, has accelerated. I think everybody now knows the Panchamrit targets launched at COP26. as well as ambitious commitments to support green hydrogen, solar through ISA, CDRI working on resilient infrastructure. This is about sustainability, mobility, electric vehicles. And now the LIFE campaign has just been launched last week that many of us partnered in by the Prime Minister Modi in terms of unleashing a transformative change in the way that each and every individual leads their lives. So I think, colleagues, in closing, just to say, I think it's not an exaggeration if we look at the global SDG targets that nearly half of those targets live here in India. And we in the UN system are here as partners committed to be with India along this journey to help chart the course. Because if India leads towards sustainable, inclusive, green recovery, the region and the world will as well. We in the UN are delivering more together than ever. We are a partnership that is greater than the sum of the parts. Very pleased to say that we are launching a new 5-year UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework later this year, co-designed together with you, with the country. So it's a very exciting time for us as well. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the conversation. Aaj ki chacha achi rahe, bahut dhanyavad.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sharp. Despite the dismal picture that is around us, I really appreciate the positivity that he is bringing to the table. I'd like to now invite the UN Assistant Secretary General and UNDP Regional Director for Asia and Pacific, Ms. Connie Vikni, who has over 2 decades of experience of the United Nations mission and UNDP's role in sustainable development agenda. She has a deep knowledge of the Asia-Pacific region, as well as the global, regional, and country-level workings of UNDP across policy, program management, and operations. Ms. Connie has also recently edited a volume, The Great Upheaval. This volume examines the strengths of the Asian-Pacific response to the pandemic and the weaknesses that the region must re-engineer to rebound. It reimagines social and economic pathways to revamp production modes and networks to rekindle sustainable growth. May I invite you, ma'am, to please share some thoughts.
Thank you very much. And it is always such a privilege to be back home. This is, I very much consider India and Delhi home for me and for my family. And it has been a while. It's been 2.5 years due to the pandemic that I haven't been able to return. So this is a special pleasure and to be here. And I want to recognize the Honorable Saran, Dr. Nageswaran, Shiv Kumar, and Shombi, Baha, Shoko, our UN and UNDP teams, and friends. Maybe let me just start by picking up from where Shombi left off, which is to say that the challenges that are being faced by a country as large and as complex as India are not distinct from those being faced by so many in the region or in the world, but they're amplified by the size and the need to encompass the all of what this country is, but also what the country must stand for. Not just for Asia and the Pacific, but for the world. So that lends a certain acceleration and spotlight on the choices that this country will make. Now, if I look at just a couple of issues, if I take the issues of the deepest vulnerabilities that are being faced in this country, and again, by those across the world, affected by the shocks. And yet, if you think about how we measure these vulnerabilities, for the most part, we're still looking at single indicators of income, which hardly captures the multidimensionality of vulnerability, let alone poverty. And that is something that I think COVID just threw out there and said, think again. You cannot define your development strategies and policies, whether at the local level or at a national level, with measures that are so limited. Similarly, huge changes in the world of work, for example, and redefining for what is and how fragile these so-called, let me call the world of work an institution, how fragile these are when these multiple shocks hit it. And we have no plan B. And so what is it that can help those who fall off whether it's formal or informal sector? Look at how the informal sector was hit here and in many countries. And yet, do we have the range of instruments and the types of resources that need to be very much a plan B? And maybe some of you might say, well, we've been saying for a long time that plan B should have been plan A. And so I would like us to discuss and debate some of these issues on how we are thinking going forward on what might be solutions to some of these problems. And even there, to be very humble, to say these may just be solutions for the moment. So what is it more from a problem-solving point of view that we look at that can be more sustained going forward? Now, certainly, we are seeing India's role in the region and the world taking on a bolder stand. And here, this is primarily in the decarbonization agenda and accelerating the climate agenda. And this is a deeply political agenda. This is not purely technical. I would say we have finally caught up with understanding the science. We are much better at using technology, but the human frailty of being able to wrap our minds around the power of what we need to do together, because this is a shared responsibility. Often, the smallest emitters with the smallest carbon footprints bear the deepest cuts on climate, on the harshness of climate change, and are unable to do much about it unless the big players, North and South, come together and change their targets and what they can do together, not least in the area of climate financing. So if I look at the big issues, and these are not straight lines, and there are no easy answers. So basically, whatever you say, you're not wrong, because so many multiple disciplines and opinions need to keep the debate fresh. But most importantly, it has to keep our leaders and our institutions honest and say, look, let us see where we went wrong. Let us change course. We are not sure whether anyone has the right answers. But we can try and test and try again. And just the three big areas that I'll leave you to, and I'm sure Baha will lead us through this debate, is first the deep revisiting of what we've called growth strategies. And growth strategies up until this moment have been based on intense carbon-based and carbon-dependent growth. And shifting away from that is easier said than done. There are winners and losers. There are costs. And if we're not honest about those costs and how to mitigate those costs, then we keep kicking the can down the road, because politically and financially, it is too much to bear, and certainly too much to bear in the short term. So how do we actually pick this up from a longer term point of view? Manufacturing and industrialization remains key, but this has to be done differently. So here comes the question of energy, and not just only energy access, but also energy justice and energy security. Now, if you put those three things together, that in itself would say to you, I'm not going to get out of bed, because this is a huge challenge and a huge conundrum. Because the minute you think you're shifting on one, it causes a widening gap or a break in the other. So if you take the three together, and the war in Ukraine has shown us this issue of energy security has become critical for countries. And at the same time, within a country, the issues of fairness, justice, cost, energy access. Let me move to a second set of priorities, leaving the climate and sustainability and energy agenda. And that is addressing the deep millions and millions, well, in this country, 1 billion cuts that have to do with the agenda around inequality and vulnerability that is truly coming at it from different aspects of why someone feels vulnerable. And often our policies don't ask that question. They don't ask people, why do they feel insecure and vulnerable? And yet citizen surveys across the world, when you ask what concerns you most, even the poorest don't say poverty. They speak about injustice. They speak about discrimination and unfairness. And yet most of our policies as a global community, but also as nations, don't address those issues at the heart of the matter. Now, it's interesting that when we look at some of the income indicators, this is why I come back to this, it hides so much. And in so many countries, the most poor often remain poor. Those just below the poverty line move up and down, above, and then get pushed down when there's a shock, then they move up again. But the bottommost group are hardly ever are able to, as a group, move up. And one has to deeply ask about what are the structural inequalities and injustices that keep the poorest poor. And the last point that I want to speak to, and this I won't go into detail, but I am happy to speak to it more in the panel, of what all of this means then for both the content and the way in which our governance models work, our policy making works, and how that, and where is the world of financing in all of this. And the world of financing and the rest of it seem to be diverging and not converging. And if a country is measured by the number of its billionaires or its number of unicorns, is that something to be proud of? So how do we get the world of financing to come in and converge on some of these big issues that we need to move on? So it's not just with local or national governments. It's not just with the region. It is a global responsibility and obligation to keep these issues on the front burner and to push hard on making some of the bigger disruptive changes that have to happen. So the nominal, marginal changes, that happens and that will continue. But where are the big leapfrog moments that will truly transform a different way in which countries not just progress, but what we define as progress has to change as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Vikni. Thank you for flagging some of the concerns that need to be addressed today. Ladies and gentlemen, our keynote speaker for today is the former Foreign Secretary, Government of India, and former Chairman of India's National Security Advisory Board. A career diplomat, Mr. Shyam Saran has served in several capitals of the world, including Beijing, Tokyo, and Geneva. He has been India's ambassador to Myanmar, Indonesia, and Nepal, and High Commissioner to Mauritius. After a career spanning 34 years in the Indian Foreign Service and subsequent to his retirement, he was appointed the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Indo-US civil nuclear issues and later as Special Envoy and Chief Negotiator on Climate Change. Mr. Saran has also authored notable books such as How India Sees the World, and more recently, a volume, How China Sees India and the World. These are must-reads for diplomats and those in the wider academic and policy community. May I invite Mr. Shyam Saran to please give us the keynote address and set the tone, as it were, for the panel discussion that will follow.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. Ms. Vigna, UN Assistant Secretary General and UNDP Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific. Mr. Shombi Sharp, UN Resident Coordinator. Dr. Ananta Nageswaran, Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India. Dr. A.K. Shivakumar, our moderator, MS Bahar Dutt, and MS Shoko Noda, Resident Representative of UNDP here in India. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I wish to thank the UNDP for inviting me to address the UNDP policy dialogue and share some thoughts with you on how India and the region of South Asia could ensure an inclusive, green, and equitable recovery from the multiple crises that have spawned unprecedented economic, social, political, and even cultural disruptions across the world. These crises are still playing out. So our interventions, in a sense, are akin to shooting at a moving target. We talk about recovery, but frankly, the world of yesterday is gone, never to return. We have to reimagine the world that is in the process of being born and hope that we may be able to shape it in the direction of an equitable, inclusive, and ecologically sustainable future. Even though the contours of the emerging world are still nebulous, some trends represent significant continuities. As far as I can see, globalization is really here to stay because it is driven by technological advancement. In particular, the rapid spread of digital economy. We have seen how during the pandemic, there has been almost a quantum leap in the development of digital technologies. There may be some stalling of globalization. We are witnessing in country after country eruptions of narrow nationalism and parochial sentiments. It is true that globalization has so far enriched the few and impoverished the many. But it is not globalization which is the culprit. The acute inequalities we see are the consequence of the failure of public policy, the abdication of responsibility of political leadership to ensure the equitable distribution of the fruits of globalization. Going forward, countries will need to embrace globalization and indeed embrace it even more wholeheartedly because the great gains in poverty alleviation and eradication, both in our region as well as across the world, this is referred to in the UNDP paper, is really the gift of globalization. We need to evolve both national and global policies to promote globalization and parallelly to establish institutional arrangements and processes to ensure the equitable distribution, inclusivity, and capacity building so that we can spread the skills to a new generation of workers and professionals which will be required really to grasp the opportunities which globalization will constantly keep creating as it is doing already in the past 3 decades. The second key trend relates to the rising salience of global and cross-national issues, which are really not amenable to national or even regional solutions. Climate change certainly is one such challenge. The ongoing public health challenge in the form of the COVID pandemic is another. There are several others, including the ubiquity of cyberspace, the indispensability of space-based assets. These are challenges that cannot be dealt with through competitive negotiating processes. So let me just here give you a sense of my own experience as a negotiator. So, as when we go for negotiations on any particular issue, what is the brief that our government gives us? The government's brief is you give as little as you can and you extract as much as you can. That is the brief that each one of us is given. And if every delegation is following that brief, it should come as no surprise to you that the outcome is usually a least common denominator outcome. Now, the kind of challenges that we are facing demand actually global and collaborative responses. Competitive approaches, as I say, will not work. You need maximal outcomes. So dealing with 21st century challenges require maximal outcomes, which only collaborative approaches based on a certain sense of international solidarity and even common humanity alone can deliver. And it is in this regard that the UN and its agencies could actually play a very critical role. The third trend relates to the cross-domain nature of most challenges that we face today. The domains, for example, of energy, water, and food security are integrally related, and there are very strong feedback loops amongst them. So when I was doing climate change work, you may have heard that there had been stories about, farmer suicides, for example, in Andhra. And when we went a little deeper, we discovered that it was not really crop failure, which was leading to bankruptcies of families and therefore leading to some suicides. It was that families were being bankrupted by increasing health costs, hospital costs. Why? Because in order to increase yields, which is necessary for food security, they were using chemical fertilizers. They were using very toxic pesticides. They were not using any protective equipment. And therefore, across this area, there was a very huge incidence of, skin diseases, problems with their eyesight, breathing problems, all because of this ingestion of these toxic chemicals. So on the one hand, you were promoting food security by these using these technologies, but on the other hand, you were creating, a health crisis, but you were not able to connect the two. The state of Punjab, which is our breadbasket in a sense, also has the highest incidence of cancer in the country. So what I'm trying to put across to you is that this interconnection amongst the different challenges that we face, this is something which has to be brought out into the open. And it is here where the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN adopted in 2015 is really, for me, a pioneering effort in introducing cross-domain approaches. All the 17 SDGs that you will see connections amongst the different aspects of our developmental challenge. So we have to ensure that whatever we are doing, whatever intervention we are making in one domain does not cancel out what we are trying to achieve in another domain. I believe that this is now indispensable in good policy making, and the UN and its agencies working together again can play a most significant and catalytic role in this respect. Now, the government of India, of course, has done a great deal to deploy these cross-disciplinary interventions in several important domains. And the level of coordination among different arms of the government, I must say, has improved recently. The Prime Minister himself has led many of these coordinated interventions. However, we now need to move from more limited coordinated approaches to truly collaborative approaches. And this requires a different mindset and also an altered institutional structure. This is where, again, the UN and its agencies can provide very valuable support. In my work in the government and as Prime Minister's Special Envoy on Climate Change, I became aware how the people of this country, even in its most remote nooks and corners, are constantly innovating, experimenting, finding solutions to everyday problems. If we could pull together these local innovations and ideas on a national, even an international platform, find ways to scale them up, we could face the world around the corner with optimism and confidence. The inclusive, green, and equitable solutions that we are looking for may well lie nested in these community-generated ideas. Ms. Vikni remarked that India's problems are not unique, but they are forbidding in scale. By the same token, I would say that when India finds solutions, and if these could be amplified in the same way, perhaps there can be a very significant contribution to how the region and the world is able to bring about a much more optimistic future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saran, for that lucid and very informative keynote. We now move to the panel discussion on the emerging priorities in the context of India. Allow me to introduce our panelists to you as I request them to please join me up on stage. Dr. Anantha Nageshwaran, Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India, a distinguished writer, author, teacher, and consultant. Dr. Nageshwaran was a visiting professor of economics at Kriya University and dean of the IFMR Graduate School of Business, and has also taught at various business schools in India and Singapore previously. A former member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, he's also been an honorary senior advisor to the International Financial Services Authority of India in Gujarat and to Dwara Research on Financial System Design. Dr. A.K. Shivakumar, a development economist and evaluator working on issues related to human development, poverty, health, nutrition, basic education, and the rights of women and children. He's presently the senior consultant and policy advisor to UNICEF India, and until recently was the director of the International Center for Human Development in New Delhi. He's a visiting professor at the Ashoka University, the Indian School of Business, and the Kennedy School of Governance at the Harvard University, USA. Ms. Connie Vigna, UN Assistant Secretary General and UNDP Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific. Ms. Vigna has contributed to numerous papers, articles, and conferences in areas of public policy, institutional reform, capacity development, human rights, and leadership. Our panel will be moderated by Ms. Bahar Dutt, award-winning journalist considered as one of the foremost voices for the environment in the country. Trained as a conservation biologist and having worked as an environment editor with CNN News 18, she's won over 12 national and international awards for her reportage on green issues. She's the author of 2 books, Green Wars and Rewilding in India. And she also teaches at the Shiv Nadar University as an associate professor. As I hand over to Bahar, may I mention that after the discussion, we will have about 15 to 20 minutes of interaction and questions from the audience for our panelists, as well as for Mr. Saran, who's agreed to answer a few questions. So it's over to you, Bahar.
Thank you so much, Rini, for the introduction and for making my job easier. A very warm welcome to everybody. I emphasize the word warm. Firstly, I'd like to thank UNDP India. This is such a privilege to meet in person and have these conversations. Raise your hands, those who are tired of Zoom calls. Everybody. So please keep your masks on. We want to keep meeting in person, but yet, stick to the COVID protocols. So as we begin today's panel discussion, the temperature outside will cross 46 degrees. For your comfort, we're maintaining a temperature of 23 degrees, I think, within this room. But seriously, on a more serious note, think of the person who has to work on the streets, the men and women creating India's infrastructure right now under the blazing sun, the street vendors, the people who live on the streets, literally. Climate change as a problem, we used to think, when I used to report as a journalist, we used to talk about it in the future. And I find that when I do my reports now, it's here, it's right now at our doorstep. And we know that the rich will be able to deal with this problem. They'll somehow protect themselves. But what's going to happen to the poor? It's obvious that if we have to prevent catastrophic global warming, we need a low carbon pathway. And for that low carbon pathway to happen, there will have to be changes in our economy. The good news is that India made a number of commitments at Paris. We are one of the few countries to have fulfilled those commitments. The bad news is we asked for finance. That hasn't happened. There still isn't enough money on the table, or some would argue there isn't any at all. So given all these limitations, given all that's happening in the world today, how do we make this transition to a green, resilient, sustainable economy? And I am honored to have experts with me today who probably face these issues every day. I'm going to ask them to weigh in on some of these issues. And my first question is going to be to the Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India. You probably face these questions, sir, every day in the job that you do. So let me start. You said recently in an interview that despite global uncertainties caused by the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, India is still better placed among the large economies because of an improved financial system and a robust corporate health, end quote. And also that India will be at a $20 trillion GDP by 2040 with a per capita income of close to $15,000. You seem very optimistic, sir. The question is whether the Indian economy can achieve this while being green, sustainable, and inclusive. If yes, what are the government's actions to ensure this? And what are the challenges that you foresee in achieving growth that works for people and our planet?
Thank you for those questions. I'm very happy to be here. Good morning to everybody. First, let me explain the number. On the face of it, it looks a bit optimistic, as you put it, or even ambitious. But if we get to $5 trillion by 26-27, we are now 3.3, and that's not such a difficult target to reach. Then, if you simply assume 10% nominal GDP growth in dollar terms, then you get to 10 trillion by 2033-34, and another doubling with the same rate. So achieving a 10% dollar GDP growth in nominal terms isn't so daunting. Of course, I will come to the other questions that you raised, the constraints and challenges. So while the number 20 trillion from where we are today might sound very ambitious or optimistic, it is, if you break it down into annual growth targets, it isn't particularly daunting. That's the first part of it. The second part of it is that I said we are relatively better placed compared to others, and I stand by that, and I emphasize it's a relative statement. Okay. The third question is about, can we do that? Can we achieve this $20 trillion, no matter how realistic or modest and not ambitious it is, considering that, as Ms. Connie Vikni pointed out in her earlier opening remarks, much of the growth experience of the developed world of today is based on carbon fuels. And therefore, how are we going to get there facing these constraints? Yes, of course, it will be presumptuous on my part to claim that I have the answers. I don't. However, if we have to tick some important boxes as to what would take us to get there, we tick some of the boxes, such as the intent, such as the commitment, and such as putting whatever money we have on the table, and some of the achievements we have made so far with respect to installing non-fossil fuel-based energy or blending ethanol. So, and spelling out numerical commitments, not just with respect to 2070, but even with respect to 2030. So that kind of does suggest that there is a seriousness about the accountability part of it. So these boxes are ticked. And most importantly, lastly, I would say, recently, about 10 days ago, the OECD has come up with a survey of public attitudes in G20 countries towards carbon pricing. It has about 40,000 respondents across 20 countries, and it's fairly well represented in terms of education, gender, income, rural, urban, etc. What is very insightful is that public attitudes in developed countries towards carbon pricing and making the necessary behavioral adjustments to have a transition to net zero, there is a lot more resistance over there in the developed world. And consistently across different sets of questions, as the OECD report explicitly points out, Indian and China respondents were far more constructive and flexible and willing to adapt. And again, a former ambassador and former foreign secretary, Mr. Shyam Saran, in his keynote address did point out that in far-flung corners of the country, he has observed people doing innovative things and adapting themselves to changes, and there could be answers hidden there for the rest of India and for the rest of the world to replicate. And I think that is where our hope lies. We don't have a template for making this kind of a transition because, as she put it in her remarks, we have been led by carbon-based growth. And there will be issues and also human frailties that will come in the way. For example, with respect to the pandemic and the vaccination program, notwithstanding noble statements of sharing the vaccine technology, etc., several countries didn't end up doing so. But maybe that is the reason why Africa, despite not getting enough vaccines, is actually doing quite well with respect to the pandemic. Because that is where I think we also need to keep in mind that there could be law of unintended consequences for the better as well, not just with respect to only negative things. And that is where luck and chance are going to play a role. And that is where I think we need to be much more humble about prescribing answers to these questions from the experts' perspective. People may be doing a lot of things because they know the context, they know the pathway, and they know what they are experiencing, and they may have better answers. So as you said, all of us discussing this in 23 degrees Celsius when the outside temperature is 46, we may not be having the answers. Thank you.
All right, so that was I must say, a very honest and humble admission. Let me come to you, Dr. Shivakumar. As a development economist, you've advocated for greater focus on areas such as nutrition, health, education as part of our development paradigm. There is widespread acknowledgement that even before the pandemic, we weren't doing that well as far as the social sector's performance is concerned. Do you think we need a complete rethink? We're talking about resetting our economy, resetting the way, moving away from business as usual. Do we need a rethink of the way we work in order for India to achieve, for instance, the Sustainable Development Goals?
Thank you, Bahar, for this question, and thank you for inviting me to the panel. Let me begin by making two general comments. First, India's impressive growth record over the past 3 decades has made millions more prosperous and also pulled millions out of poverty. A larger proportion of the population has access to decent housing, water, electricity, and even basic goods and services. So it is not uncommon, for example, to see those living in slums owning televisions, smartphones, and vehicles. This convergence in the space of commodities has, however, created an illusion of equality. While there is a convergence in the space of commodities, there is a clear divergence in the space of opportunities and capabilities. Finding a job for young people has become even more difficult. Having access to good quality healthcare remains a challenge, and we face new health problems every day. Despite the economic record, 36% of children under 5 are stunted. The clue to this lies in the poor health and nutritional status of women and the extremely poor dietary habits. In fact, the National Family Health Survey says only 11% of children under 5 receive minimum acceptable diets. Even in Kerala and Sikkim, where only 22 to 23% of children are stunted, these proportions are very poor. So it really calls for changes in the way society deals with women, behavior changes in terms of changing eating habits, which are not easy to come by. And of course, good quality school education still passes millions of children. The second observation is that the COVID pandemic has been an eye-opener for all nations, regardless of income levels and growth. It has made one thing clear, and I think Connie pointed this out, that nothing matters more to people than security in their daily lives. And despite the progress, the pandemic revealed the helplessness and lack of preparedness among individuals, families, communities, and most importantly, governments. So I don't want to get into what all the pandemic revealed about the strengths and weaknesses of the social sectors. We know much of it. We experienced much of it in terms of the cracks in the delivery of primary healthcare services, the shortage of public health services, the expansion of an unregulated private sector in health, and the extortionary behavior of the private sector, especially during COVID, and that the financial protection was absent, and the burden was not just on the poor, but also on the middle class. Similarly, in education, the Economic Survey 2021-22 notes a decline in the enrollment of rural children during the pandemic. It notes that the shift towards online education during the pandemic has led to increased digital divide between the haves and the have-nots. There was and then the issues of mental health facing children in schools and adolescents is also emerged as a very serious problem. So we are facing a real challenge in this space. But one thing to observe is that in the last 2 years, 2019 to 2021, there has been an increase of almost 4 million children in government school enrollment and a corresponding decrease of 3 million in the enrollment in private schools. This really bucks the trend, because until now, primary school enrollments were going up and government school enrollments were coming down, really pointing out that the income slowdown severely impacted incomes and made private schools unaffordable. The retrenchment of teachers, especially in low-fee private schools, and the inability of private schools to provide digital access. So really, the hope for the future lies in a stronger government, be it in health or in basic schooling. I also want to say that women in particular had to face several additional burdens due to the pandemic, stress of job losses and reduced earnings, increased stress and burden of domestic work due to men losing their jobs or working from home, more male deaths than female deaths, a return of migrants from cities. Women faced adverse effects on health from reduced access to maternal, child, and reproductive health services. And also, I think the media reported an increase in intra-household vulnerabilities due to an increase in domestic violence and increased pressure on adolescent girls for early marriages. So all these problems we know, but at the same time, the pandemic also highlighted several inherent strengths of Indian society. Many state governments rose to the occasion and helped address the problems of the people. And it only proves again that as far as the state is concerned, if there is a will, there is a way. Second, the pandemic revealed the commitment and dedication of millions of frontline government workers, majority of them women, especially in health and education, who braved the pandemic and continue to work without adequate protection. And finally, the pandemic revealed the potential to harness individual and communities for public action. And the number of stories we heard of small groups of people coming together, etc., was really, really wonderful. And that's where the real strength and potential lies of reworking solutions. So let me finally conclude by saying that what does India need to do differently to catch up with the reversals in the social sectors? This is really an opportunity to do 4 things differently to make up for lost ground. I'm not just looking at the pandemic, but even looking at our not so impressive record in expansion of social opportunities. The first is to get priorities right. And the solution to growth that is green, equitable, sustainable is definitely to step up public investments in health, education, nutrition, women's empowerment, and an overall expansion of social opportunities. States that have done well in terms of advancing social opportunities have also done well in terms of expanding economic opportunities. So the two go hand in hand, and to say that we will grow first and then social achievements will follow is not really working. And I think we really have to get that as a big lesson. Just to say that despite the promise made, even in health, the promise was made to step up public spending on health from 1% to 2.5 or 3% of GDP almost 20, 25 years ago. But we're still stuck at 1.2% for close to 2 decades. And why don't we prioritize? The 15th Finance Commission says that state governments should allocate at least 8% of public spending or their expenditures to health. Today, only 1 state in India is allocating more than 8%. And the average for all states is about 5.2%. So really, it is about getting the priorities right. Second is to get policies right. And by policies, I want to again say, take health. No country in the world has been able to achieve anything like universal health coverage. And I think India, at least on paper, affirms its commitment to universal health coverage without the presence of a strong public sector in health. Today, 2/3 of the healthcare is provided by the private sector. It's not surprising that private out-of-pocket expenditures on health are close to 60%, as against 10 to 15% in the rich countries like UK, France, Canada. So how can a poor country like, or a low-income or middle-income country where there are a large number of poor people afford such catastrophic health expenses? And we also know that there is no financial protection, and as was mentioned, has become a major cause of impoverishment. Take schooling. It's also ironic that even in the richest of countries, only 10 to 15% of children attend private schools. And in our country, it has touched 50%. And if you look at secondary schools, almost 2/3 of children today in India are going to private schools. Really begs the question, if the Constitution has guaranteed free and good quality education up to the age of 14 years, it should be go to K to 12, which I think it will happen. Where are we on that commitment? If 60, 70% of children are going to go to private school, how much more private can we get in health? How much more private can we get in education? And always when they talk about more public-private partnerships, I just wonder what is the direction. Third is the equally disconcerting feature is women's participation in the labor force, which has been declining. By the way, there are only 7 countries in the world where the female labor force participation rates are lower than in India. Clearly, we need right policies to expand work opportunities for women. The third important thing is to get prices right. And here often the political discussion is on commodities, whether to subsidize food, electricity, water, transport, and so on. These are important. But the same intensity of discussion is missing when it comes to subsidizing health and education. And so that good quality schooling and healthcare is not provided free of cost by the state, does not seem to trigger any major concern. And the last point I'll make is to get practices right. And I want to point to 2 dimensions of this issue. This is related to implementation of programs. One, it is well known that despite progress and increasing use of digital technologies, our well-intentioned and well-planned welfare programs do not still reach many of the poor, certainly not the poorest and the most vulnerable. So we need to do things differently. In other words, we need differentiated strategies in the social sectors that are customized to local contexts and local cultures. And these are not often in place. And that's why it's so important, as Dr. Shyam Saran also said, to see what is happening, document where local people have found local solutions and do it. The last point in this getting practices right is we need to strengthen evidence gathering and strengthen practices of evaluation so that we can improve accountability and also incorporate lessons that we learn along the way on what works, where and when, why, and most importantly, for whom. For whom is an extremely important question, as only a disaggregated view will help us address the special needs of communities that are left behind, or people with disabilities, or those living in remote areas, and so on. So let me end by saying that we recognize the interconnectedness of all social and economic factors and the environmental factors that has been brought out, but we also need to recognize the importance and interconnectedness of getting priorities right, getting policies right, getting prices right, and getting practices right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shivakumar. Some morbid statistics there, but also a reminder of how much we still have to achieve. And this actually ties in very neatly with my next question for Ms. Connie Vignaraja. The UN Secretary General, in his opening remarks at the recently convened Stockholm Plus conference, remarked, "We must place true value on the environment and go beyond the gross domestic product as a measure of human progress and well-being." So what would you say, ma'am? What are the key governance and policy reforms needed for us to adhere to this? How do we move towards a society that is environmentally sustainable and not just fixated on the GDP? You're sitting between two economists at the moment, so, so watch what you say.
Indeed. Thank you, Baha. I was very grateful that you didn't quote me to me. Which you did to the other two gentlemen. I have to be very careful when you're in the presence of journalists. They remember what you said and bring it back. But let me start with this issue of what we are measuring, and very much agree with our SG. Difficult for me to disagree with our SG, but I very much say that we just have to get away from this issue of insistently focused on GNI and GDP measures. It does not capture anything of what our keynote speaker spoke to, Honorable Saran, nor what Dr. Nageswaran nor Shiv spoke to just now. So the fact that here, the courage to look at a sub-national level, how we're actually doing on those SDGs and unpacking those is critical. So the SDG index, working to see whether that then is followed by some of the discussions, the debates, the policy decisions, but citizens' perceptions on the SDGs and whether it matters to them. And remember, the SDGs were also articulated when we first started actually putting this agenda together. We're already talking a decade ago. Things have changed. So the ability to say, look, that's a minimum agenda. Where do we go from here is going to be critical. The measures to me of how do you measure the presence or absence of opportunity? I think Mrs. Honorable Saran made this very clearly. This is key. How do you measure a sense of vulnerability and insecurity? That is key. That's what people care deeply about. The rest follows. So I think we've got a lot of work to do on that in that area. And I think UNDP, the whole UN system, very much focused on looking at this with government and non-government partners to see how to improve on this goal. I think the second is a tough one, which is how do we put public goods and a sense of the public good at the center of our debate and decisions, and not that which is self-serving. I like what Mr. Saran said, that if you all come into a conversation to say what's in it for me and my gain and your loss. So if it's a win-lose situation, the issue of public goods goes out the table. The shared common denominators cannot be your lowest common denominator. And so the same goes for multilateralism and the multilateral fora and global public goods. So we see this happening across where these are so under threat. We saw this with the vaccine, how difficult that was. So that to me is another issue of being able to then come in with financing around public goods. I think a government has a responsibility locally and nationally to finance public goods. And then at a global level, I think the whole global system needs to come in behind this. And I was amazed, by the way, at my recent visit to the hospital, and I saw the whole CoWIN platform at work. And the fact that now the government of India has agreed that this can be an open source platform that other countries can use. That is an expression of supporting a public good. And my next point is on innovation. And here I have to say, I agree and disagree with Shiv, because we hardly ever get it right. And on all of those areas, Shiv. And to me, the way then we course correct quickly, learn from our mistakes, let people create and innovate, that space has to be so important. This is, in conventional terms, is an R&D agenda, right? And at the local level, at the national level, the fact that countries are coming back to saying we have to support that R&D and innovation agenda and let that space grow and not be constrained is critical. My last issue, Baha, is that we're talking about issues like tough climate action, injustice, addressing injustice, inequality. These are hard issues. And these are not technical or technocratic issues. These are norm-based and value-based issues. So our leaders, our institutions, our policies, we're not comfortable with them being driven by core values. It's easier to have them driven by data. And so a different conversation that I think is a generational conversation. And hopefully the young people in all our countries shake the rest of us up and say what matters most is some of those norms that we need to stand for. And that's the new India, that's the new global system, that's the world we want to see and be part of. So that is a whole different level of new governance, new policy, and new practices that I hope we're working towards. Back to you.
Can you hear me? Yes. I apologize for that. Thank you, Ms. Vikni. I think what really struck a chord with me was when you spoke about vulnerability and dignity. How do you measure something like that? How do you make that a reality? And another point you made about multilateralism, the frustration of multilateralism, if negotiators are told, give as little as possible and take back as much as you can. And I see this at the UNFCCC negotiations as someone who chronicles the story. We find that there's very little progress, and you come out with a sense of deep frustration. For someone who's listening to the climate story, it appears it's just, people who are out there who go to this destination, have fun, do a couple of protest marches and come back. What is the progress made? And so I hear you when you say that multilateralism, how do we make it more meaningful, and how do we make public good more accessible and real? This, I think, is a fine note to circle it back to you, sir, Dr. Nageshwaran. Would you say that economists are uneasy with the term sustainable? Like, for economists, there is this, I would say, almost an overt preoccupation with let's consume as much as we can because it will generate more livelihoods, it will generate more services. And therefore, that becomes contrary to what a green economy is, because a green economy is all about consuming less, recycling more. So is it a conundrum that economists face? And if we have to get out of this, can we, for instance, move from GDP to gross environment product? Can we start measuring progress in terms of how many rivers we've managed to clean, how many cities we've managed to clean of air pollution? Why don't we hear of such things?
I can't speak for all economists, but I'm not entirely sure that economists are uncomfortable with the word sustainable, because even before its association and connotation with green and climate and environment in general, sustainable growth means the growth that can be sustained. So potential GDP growth, actual GDP growth, all of them are associated with the concept of sustainability in terms of what is the GDP growth that your economy can achieve. So it is not so much that there is discomfort with the use of the word sustainable, because it has been used quite generously in other contexts. That is one. Now, secondly, I'm not entirely sure that all economists swear by consumption as a sort of a salve or the answer for economic growth, because we do stress savings and capital formation being more, if I may use the word, sustainable drivers of economic growth rather than consumption. Now, when it comes to gross green product or gross green national product, whatever you want to call it, now we all know this famous quote about democracy being the worst form of all governments, but for all others, right? So I would say GDP is the worst measure of economic activity, but for all others. Because everything else that you take comes with their own limitations and serious subjectivities,
Yes,
that it is not impossible to game them. And even recently, we had stories of German regulators raiding some asset management companies and financial institutions for greenwashing allegations, etc. So if you talk about estimating green GDP, you have to estimate many intangibles, such as the valuation of ecosystem services, and then the extent of environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, and the impact of climate change that may have already been set in motion. And these are going to be extremely difficult to quantify, estimate, and put a number. So I would say we need to have different metrics that definitely have to acknowledge that this is an aspect, because if you are going to grow in the short run at a very high rate, but clearly at the expense of the environment and other consideration, then you will definitely face the consequences down the road. So it's all about the question of the kind of horizon over which you are trying to grow. So I would say there is a need for climate tagging of budgets that needs to be definitely addressed and resolved. And this issue has to be at the front and center. But to replace GDP, because the earlier, if you look at it, research has shown GDP focus was considered a good approximation because it did correlate well with other things we were interested in, such as infant mortality, such as life expectancy, such as share of health expenditure. All these things went up as GDP went up. So we were willing to accept GDP as an imprecise substitute because it did correlate well with things that we were actually interested in. And I think that is the way we need to find what are the metrics that with which GDP correlates, such that they also address the concerns that we have with respect to environment, sustainability, etc. But therefore, to move towards a green GDP would be to sort of, solving a problem with a greater problem.
Would you say that circularity or achieving circularity within our economy could be a possible way out? Because right now only 9% of the world's economy is circular. So perhaps using goods and services in a way that they make their way back into the economy could be a way out. And if that's something the government is thinking about.
Look, I think that's probably a good starting point, a more fruitful avenue of research and exploration, because even though GDP is widely followed in the financial community on others, etc. Today, we have several other indicators and indices that we are focusing on. For example, this is easy to remember, things like ease of doing business or human development index. So similarly, we need to come up with other measures which can be popularized over, by sheer dint of repetition and, publicizing. But more important in all of this is to have standards and measurements that are transparent, that are uniform. So for example, and I will take it up probably with Shiv offline, he spoke about the labor force participation rate of women and different countries. It is simply not correct or proper to compare across countries because the methodology is not standardized. And that is only one aspect of the problem. So I think what you proposed is a good starting point.
Okay, so we have a starting point. That's good progress. So I'm going to come now to the second half of this panel discussion. Let me just remind the audience here that I'm going to give you a chance to interact with the panel as well. So please keep your questions ready. We do have time for questions. There will be a mic which will be in the audience. So you just have to, instead of pointing out to the person carrying the mic, please just raise your hand to me and I'll catch your attention and point the mic person to you. So please keep your questions ready. Think about your questions. We don't want monologues. We want questions. So please, less comments, more questions, and let us know who it's directed to from our panel. So coming back to our discussion, this is the point at which I want to take in. Circling back to you, Shiv, what are the risks? Like I know you outlined in your opening remarks a blueprint of the 4 Ps, so to say. What are the risks that you foresee will hamper our ability to pursue this development trajectory? And what solutions can you share with us to address some of these risks?
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment on what Ananta and Connie said. Now, Connie, you said that, it's not about getting policies, practices, prices, and priorities right. I think the question is, how do you get them right? And I think I really want to pick up on what Ananta Nageswaran said, our chief economic advisor. It's such a refreshing way of looking at things that we don't know the solutions. You have to have an open-mindedness about it. The moment you say, I have found the solution, this is what you need to do, and drive it down from the top, it's not going to work. So I think that is really the key of it. We need to be flexible. We need to encourage decentralized decision-making, encourage local thinking, leave space to local communities to come up with suggestions and so on, and encourage innovation. So I don't think we are directly opposed. It's the how of it that I'm trying to emphasize. And I think also welcome the chief economic advisor's very refreshing approach to discussing and debating issues on whether this statistic is right or that statistic is right. And I think the way economic measurement progresses is only through discussion and debate, and a larger public debate as well, what is included and excluded. Yeah. So I think those are very important, not just among economists, but even among a larger public discussion is really the key idea of good governance. So I think that is there. So just very quickly to your questions, I see 2 risks. One is that there is the danger of becoming complacent and slipping back into doing business as usual. Once we are back on growth track and this noise of whatever, 205 trillion, 8 trillion, 50 trillion, that starts drumming, then we completely lose sight of everything else. That's a big risk. So, and the second one is that I still don't feel we have enough political support and public concern for addressing some of the issues you've raised. So how do we as a society come together to put much greater prominence to these on the public agenda? And if we don't do that, we will still be saying, this is right, that is wrong, we're not doing that. In terms of the solutions, I think we have lots of ideas have come up, but just focusing on the social sectors, I would think that we need to revisit and redefine a 5-point agenda. I think I mentioned all of them. One has to be, as economists, we have to go back to this old idea of full employment. I think somewhere along the line, we pursued growth instead of full employment. That tension was always there. We have to look at this traditional way, but new way of full employment. We have to look at universal health coverage, no question. Universal social protection is the third. Universal access to good quality schooling. Today's headlines in Indian Express said some only 40% of those who've joined engineering colleges have the basic math requirement. Which means 60% are just not there in engineering colleges who have that. So it's not surprising that when you finish your engineering, you're not fit to get a job as an engineer. So all these are very serious problems on how we are actually playing with the lives of young people without any serious concern. And the last one is, of course, expanding the freedoms that women have, especially in terms of access to economic opportunities and exercising social and cultural freedoms. So on the economic opportunities, yes, there is a debate on is it low and is the work participation low and declining or what number it is. But the real question is, are women being pushed out of the workforce, or are they really voluntarily staying back at home? And that's the debate question. So lastly, I would say that once again, I'll end by saying that in terms of the solution, we go back to looking at very modestly at multiple solutions, innovations, decentralized decision-making, and strengthening community processes. That's what I would. Thank you.
Strengthening community processes? No. I can just speak loudly otherwise. Yes. So number of suggestions there, and I agree with you, sir, on the danger of being complacent and moving back to business as usual. I see the energy levels in the room dipping. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to shake things up a little bit. I'm going to give my panel a scenario. It's a scenario which probably Dr. Nageshwaran faces on a more real basis. Perhaps the rest of us don't. But let's just imagine that the Prime Minister has walked in and he wants our suggestions. And he wants our suggestions on a couple of low-hanging fruits. What are the one or two interventions, immediate interventions that we need to take? And he's asking us this to ensure that a post-pandemic economy is green, inclusive, and sustainable. Each one of you, the one or two immediate recommendations you would suggest to the Prime Minister. He's here somewhere in the room and he's listening to us. So please.
Emphasis on public versus personalized modes of transport.
Okay, that's a good one. Okay. And why do you say that, sir?
But naturally, the carbon footprint and the consumption of fossil fuel is very much linked to that. The second one I wanted to mention, but it's a little bit long term, we have to start investing in getting the right supply of metals and minerals required to do the green transition.
Yes.
Right now, the sequencing is backward.
Right.
Across the world, though, not about India alone, across the world. We need to ensure that we have the right ingredients before we start pushing everybody towards renewable energy. And then you find that people don't have the right amount of metals and minerals required to switch or make electric vehicles, etc. Then, in fact, we would be setting things back very badly.
Yes. So I think what the CA is referring to over here is minerals like nickel and cobalt. Beg your pardon?
Lithium, nickel,
yes,
everything.
So a lot of the minerals that Dr. Nageshwaran is referring to, just for the for a context, India may not be the producer of many of these minerals. We have to import these minerals. When we're talking about nickel and cobalt, there's actually only, I think, one company in India that manufactures nickel. So when the world is telling us to pursue low carbon growth, to pursue a trajectory which transitions to renewable energy, how are we to do that if the access to these minerals is limited? So I think that's a very good point you've raised, sir. Ms. Vikni, what would you suggest?
Well, I would take the issue of putting, if there was any financial constraints, I would put one's last rupee in girls' education, quality education. I think growing the space for girls and women to be more than 50% of the contributing force socially, politically, and economically is what will take this country really to that next generational leap. And the second is coming back to what Dr. Nageshwaran just said. I think the greening of an economy is one thing, but how do you make sure that that then reaches all levels of society. So I think public transport is a big area. It's one of the toughest to switch in any country, but it directly impacts people's lives.
She correctly said that's the toughest switch to make. And the OECD survey referred to in my earlier remarks said developed country respondents in that survey were extremely resistant to making these adjustments with respect to three things when it comes to personal behavior. It's one thing to think global, but it's important to act local, right? So three questions were asked about their consumption of meat versus plant products, about air travel, about personal modes of transport. In all these three areas, the willingness to change among the developed country respondents was extremely low and in sharp contrast to what it was from the developing country respondents in that OECD survey. Just
That's an interesting insight. Dr. Shivakumar, your suggestions, the Prime Minister is in the room. What would you say to him?
Yeah, I think it's working. So two quick suggestions. One is I think this is the opportune time to reconsider the role of a welfare state, especially vis-a-vis private markets in health and education. We cannot let this slip any further. And second is that along with a more accountable state that takes responsibility for delivering on the assurances in our constitution, it is extremely important to simultaneously expand the space for civil society organizations, NGOs, and the corporate sector, private sector through corporate social funding, etc., to ensure that the benefits really reach the poorest, welcome the innovations in the private sector into the development sector, encourage community organizations to ensure that last mile reach, and so that the most vulnerable people are not left out of welfare programs. Thank you.
I'd just like to say a big round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much. You've kept it real, you've kept it interesting, and I personally have learned a lot, but I'm not going to let you get away so easily because we're now going to open up this discussion for questions from the audience. Yes, if we could get a mic to the lady in white. Yes, please, go ahead. Please, if you can share with us your name, perhaps your organization, and then your question.
Hopefully I'm audible. Hi all, I'm Mahima Kaushal and I work as an economic advisor in the British High Commission, New Delhi. An esteemed honor and a pleasure to be here amongst many others. All nations, I have a comment and a question, but I'll keep it short, like you said. All nations have focused on carbon-led growth, so why is there pressure on India alone? If you're asking India to lead by example, then I agree, but the overall pressure on India as a developing nation by the developed nations is not the right approach. My second point is that some panelists suggested growth being a great indicator, GDP being a great indicator of growth. And as a moderator, you rightly asked, I think development indicators show us that growth being at 10, 11, 12% don't necessarily mean we are developing well. So it might be cognitive bias of yours to think that economists think that growth versus development is not an important factor, because I'm an economist and I definitely agree. My question basically is to the panel that the macroeconomic dynamics currently are very, very uncertain. COVID has taught us that. And the WHO data, if I may quote, tells you that there's 1.6 billion plastic waste that have come up every day after COVID. We use, I think, more than some X million of non-biodegradable masks that we also have kept outside, and all of us use it, so none to be blamed alone. So what is the corrective policy action that we're looking at? I totally value the points that have been made, but I would want us to stick on the subject to understand not 5-year, not 10-year, but what is the action we must take now?
Okay, so you actually had many questions and many comments there, but you've spoken about the importance of not being fixated on the GDP, and you had a comment on that. Is there any particular person you would like to direct your question to, but just to the panel? All right. And you've also raised the question of plastic pollution, marine pollution, and the fact that we're all using all these masks and they've only added to the burden further. right? Have I understood your question correctly?
Yes, that's my
Yes.
question. Thank
All
you.
right. So in fact, UNDP does have a program on this. Would someone from UNDP like to answer this? UNDP, if they're in the room? On some of the work that is done by you to reducing plastic pollution? Would anybody, Shoko, would you like to take that, please? Could we get a mic here in the front? Or Ashish? Oh, yes, please.
So for plastic recycling, we have supported Safai the waste pickers, for them to have much more, how to say, healthier life, better income. So when we talk about plastic recycling, it is not, or waste management, it's not only about the environment, because in the end, who is going to clean the environment? It's us, but also those are the most, the poorest people, the waste pickers. So our approach is to focus on those, especially women who have been in the informal sector, do not have access to health services. Their families are also trapped in poverty, and so we are providing also the educational opportunities to those waste pickers family members, and to holistically lift those marginalized vulnerable population out of the poverty. So we do have this waste management program, but that is not only focusing on environment.
Okay, so yeah, just to add to what Shoko is saying, there's a program in Goa, I believe, that UNDP runs on the ground, or is it in partnership with the government there, which is for the Safai Sena?
Yes.
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 And so I think what she's trying to say, and just to build on that, is that it's all very well to say recycle, but the person who's recycling your garbage at the end of the day is on the lowest rung as far as poverty and development is concerned. So how about empowering those people who are performing this job and making sure that the waste segregation happens, it happens in hygienic conditions. And it's not just something which is happening at a garbage dump. It's interesting. You can have a look at this program. I've seen a couple of pictures on the UNDP website, and I would urge you to have a look at it. I believe UNEP also has a program on reducing marine plastic litter. Can I just quickly add, as we're taking the questions, if you have any questions for Mr. Shyam Saran, he's available in the audience as well, in relation to some of the points that he raised in his opening speech. So any questions? Yes, sir, please go ahead.
So if I can, hi, morning, everyone. So I am from the International Labour Organization. Kelvin Sargent is the name. And I'm happy to be here for this discussion, coming from another part of the world where the issue of GDP and all of these things are also quite relevant.
Yes.
I'm going to comment on the waste management issue, and then I'll ask 3 questions to each of the panelists.
One question, sir, just
one question each.
Yeah.
Yeah. The waste management is, we in the ILO, we also have a program on waste management, looking at principles and rights at work in Pune and Ahmedabad. It's a pilot project just started, working with the waste pickers as well. I myself visited the dumps and I saw the informal workers. I went to see the segregation of waste. Very, very interesting what I have seen. And there is call for a waste management policy. What we're looking at is biomedical, chemical, and plastic waste coming out of COVID. Okay. But certainly there's need for a whole waste management policy in India, which is sadly needed. 3 questions. One.
So one question, just one, so that I can.
My 3 questions, but one to each of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just one question.
Okay,
I would just so that everybody gets clear.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about Ms. Wijnawara. You talked about the role of innovations and research and development, which I think is very important. But who should lead this innovation and development? Is it the private sector? Is it the government? And what is the role for MSMEs in all of this, which you spoke about earlier on? And the second question really is the issue of just transition. I heard a lot about GDP growth and 2 trillion economy, But where does just transition fit into all of this? Thanks.
All right, so two questions there. Where does just transition fit into all this? And when you're talking about research and development, is it just with the private sector? Is it with government, with communities? What are you referring to?
Well, very quickly on the question on innovation and who funds it. We've come through a period of 50, 60, maybe even 80 years of actually national governments funding the majority of R&D or primary R&D. I think the world has moved now to this being a multi-sector, multi-institutional agenda. So some of those innovations don't need to be planned. They're happening locally. They do need to be financed. And you see private sector, and I had the interesting opportunity also to speak with a number of private sector based out of Delhi, but working all over India and many in other countries, where increasing their innovation and R&D budgets. They have to. It's also a survival issue. It's good for their bottom line. So it's not just a social good. It's where economics and the public good meets. So I think there is a model here developing, which is the combined efforts of government, private sector, and civil society with the micro and the informal sector also innovating. And I think this is where we can't put it into a box because much of the amazing things are happening also in other parts of the world. When the space for innovation, the policy space and the regulatory space is there, and then you let innovators innovate. That's the whole idea. Is to have that larger space and not constrain. Thank you.
All right, we have a question here. Please go ahead, sir.
आप सभी को मेरा सच नमस्कार। भोपाल से हूँ, इम्तियाज अली नाम है, सार्थक संस्था से। प्लास्टिक वेस्ट मैनेजमेंट में जो काम हुआ है, या भोपाल मॉडल एक प्लास्टिक वेस्ट में डेवलप हुआ 2004 में, उसको कई स्टेट्स ने रिप्लिकेट किया, यूएनडीपी ने भी इसको अडॉप्ट करके कई शहरों में रिप्लिकेट किया। मेरा आनंद जी से सवाल यह है कि सोशल ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस में ऐसे कई प्रोजेक्ट हैं कि जिनको आप बारीकी से अध्ययन करके उसका रिप्लिकेशंस नेशनल लेवल पे कर सकते हैं। हमने जो भोपाल मॉडल क्रिएट किया था, इसको भारत सरकार ने अपनी प्लास्टिक वेस्ट मैनेजमेंट पॉलिसी में डाला और आज लगभग 5000 शहरों में रिप्लिकेट हो रहा है। तो मेरा आपके इस मंच से अनुरोध है कि जो भी आपने आज जो नीति संवाद जो प्रोग्राम रखा है, इसमें इस तरह के सोशल इम्पैक्ट करने वाले जो प्रोजेक्ट सिविल सोसाइटी चला रही है, उनको बारीकी से देख के उन पर बात करके उनको अगर पॉलिसी में लाया जाएगा तो उसके सोशल भी इम्पैक्ट निकलेंगे, इकोनॉमिकल इम्पैक्ट भी निकलेंगे और एनवायरमेंटल इम्पैक्ट भी निकलेंगे। धन्यवाद।
Okay, so that was just for just to translate very quickly. You spoke about the Bhopal waste management scheme that has been introduced in the city, which the government of India also replicated in how many cities you said? 5,000 cities across India. Okay. And what he's suggesting is that more of such grassroots examples, if we can include in such discussions, and if we find that the government of India can scale that up, then there are greater opportunities there for on the ground work and making a lot of the conversations that we've had an actuality. Is that correct, sir? Yes. All right. We need questions, leader. Yes, the lady in the front here, please.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I'm Mamta, Senior Social Development Advisor from FCDO British High Commission. It's good to see the three words together: inclusive, green, and equitable recovery. Usually we just think it's green recovery and everything else will follow. So we're really happy to see it all together. So just building on that, when we talk about green recovery, we've talked about MSMEs and the role that they'll play. And women being in the informal sector. So our own data, Government of India data says it's less than 30%. So there is something that we need to do there. I just wanted to understand what more can we do, especially for the micro sector where the bulk of our MSMEs is. And if we're talking about a green recovery, we have to have very focused and very targeted incentives, policies for it. So what are some of the good practices, or what are some of the good policies that we can take from other countries to look at, or inspire ourselves, look at other states? And my second is around data. So a lot of times India doesn't score very well on these international indices because of our size and for various reasons methodological. How do we counter that? I mean, is there this thing where we can place our data out more openly and more regularly? I mean, we build a better communication about what we've done and where we stand on some of these issues.
Okay.
Thank you.
So that's to Dr. Nageshwaran, right? Sorry. Okay, so how do we ensure greater participation of women, especially when it comes to MSMEs? And the second question was, India comes out with data, but that's often questioned. How do we make sure that we do a better job of putting our data out there and out to the world? And perhaps I would say, perhaps our public relations better in terms of the data, people believing that data and other governments believing that data. How do we ensure that?
I think women participation in the MSME sector, women becoming entrepreneurs will have to start with being given opportunities for education, as she put it. I think the more today, because if you go to institutions of higher learning, the concept of entrepreneurship is now becoming well accepted, and there are incubators in different institutions, not just in metros, but also in tier 2 and tier 3 cities. So the more we expose our women to these institutions and they go through these entire secondary and tertiary education, they will naturally be exposed to these concepts and these opportunities, and it'll happen. And of course, we have to have separate explicit financing considerations given for women-led businesses. And to some extent, there has to be a certain component of affirmative action. But the question is, it shouldn't become an entitlement. It shouldn't lead to performance considerations being diluted, etc. But otherwise, there has to be some specific opportunities extended to them. As far as the countering some of the indices is concerned, I think there is not one particular approach is the answer. Putting data out there from the government side is one answer. Sometimes, well, you have to go into the details of their calculation. That's also important. And the third option should also be exercised, which is to ignore some of them.
Okay. You've given us many news points. If I were the journalist, I would say many news points there. So well done. All right. We can have two more questions. All right. The lady at the back in the orange sari, please. Yes. And I would urge you to please ask questions. Go ahead.
Great session, panelists, and thank you for the invitation.
We can't hear you, ma'am.
Move your mic closer, ma'am. No, just move the mic closer to you.
Now is it okay?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry about it. So great session. Thank you for the topic and the session. My name is Dr. Ketaki Bapat from Principal Scientific Advisor, Government of India, and working as a senior scientist. Two things are there. One is that very aptly it was discussed that the community involvement and is very much important for bringing out the change. And my request would be how we can create a channel for reaching out the frugal technologies to the ground level, where the technology translation at the ground level is very important. And when you talk about these technologies which are low cost, which are actually developed by some good things also, but they may not have the commercial viability or the potential. And every time these kind of efforts have been actually, valued about how much you have spent and how much you have got the returns. So which way we can actually create a channel or something like that. And another thing is this climate change and the biodiversity conservation. Will there be all the time for good things? Funding is a problem, or initiative is a problem. Not that people are not working, but as a channel, something can be done. Thank you so much.
Okay, so how do we make global technologies accessible to people on the ground? That was the first question. I'm sorry, ma'am, I didn't get your second question. And because we're out of time, we're gonna,
Biodiversity.
yeah, I know, but I didn't get the gist of the question. So let's answer the first question, global technologies and making them more accessible. Dr. Shivakumar?
Local technology.
Why don't you say that again? I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I couldn't hear.
no, madam, this is about the frugal, I would say, or the low cost technology or the good innovation for only applicable at the rural, where you will not have like a typical commercial product or
Okay.
so. It would be personalized, backed with the cultural.
I understand. So low cost technology and making it, scaling it up at the local level. It doesn't necessarily need to go to the global level. How do we do that? Ms. Vikni Raja or Dr. Shivakumar?
let me just very quickly say one thing on that and then hand to anyone who wants to come in. I think you're very right that often some of the best low-cost technologies are still not commercially viable at scale. But both private sector, responsible business must also, we always use the word subsidy only with government, but I think responsible businesses must also have different tracks where they can sell above market rate to those who can afford to buy it, and they must. But they must have also a track that allows for these technologies to be available to those who can't afford it at subsidized rates. In some places, government will step in as well, but I think it's about time businesses just did it also themselves.
All right. I have been told that we have to wind up. We've completely run out of time. Thank you so much. You've been a wonderful audience, but I have to thank our panelists. I know you all have busy lives, but you've taken the time out. You've been frank and you've been very open and honest about your recommendations. Thank you so much again for coming here and for talking to all of us.
Thank you very much to the speakers, Dr. Nageshwaran, Dr. Kumar, and Ms. Vikni Raja. If I could request you all to please remain on stage. And Bahar, thank you so much for ably steering the conversation. I'd like to now call upon Ms. Shoko Noda, Resident Representative UNDP India, in charge of one of UNDP's largest country programs globally and leading UNDP India's work on sustainable development goals, climate action, biodiversity conservation, digital health and governance, and skilling. She's also a strong advocate for gender equality, and I could just request her to please thank our speakers and also to say a few words.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Saran, Dr. Nageshwaran, Shiv, Connie, Bahar, and also Shambi. This has been a very enriching, fascinating discussion. Thank you also for the audience for engaging with such interest and vigor on these important issues facing both the Asia-Pacific region and especially in India. As highlighted today and affirmed by our own experiences, the world is currently facing major challenges in the shift towards green and equitable socioeconomic growth. The COVID-19 pandemic, global supply shocks, climate disasters, and wars such as those in Ukraine are only some of these challenges. Yet, these pressures have evoked strong policy responses in countries across the world. And in India's case, this has culminated in return to the pre-pandemic rate of economic growth. However, this growth has not been equitable, erasing gains in poverty reduction and widening the gender gap, as we discussed. 271 million people were lifted from the poverty between 2005 to 2015. However, we have more to be lifted. So the continued efforts are needed to ensure that no one is left behind. Sustainability must also remain central to the policy directives. As such, the government's emphasis on green energy, stimulus to EVs, incentives for ecological friendly agriculture in this year's budget are all welcome news. Even so, the road to carbon neutrality is long, and the need for climate action is very high, especially as over 80% of India's people live in areas vulnerable to climate disasters. Also, 58% of the population rely on agriculture. In this context, UNDP remains committed to supporting India's aspiration towards inclusive recovery and its priority areas, including access to social protection, skill development, climate resilience, and innovative SDG solution. So once again, big thanks, and we look forward to having this kind of conversations again very soon. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now just perform a small little ceremony that we have adding to the, or rather reducing the carbon footprint as much as we can. So if I could request Mr. Shombi Sharp to please do us the honor of presenting a small little token of appreciation to Mr. Saran. Thank you very much, Mr. Sham Saran. Thank you very much. If I could request Ms. Noda, please, to do us the honors on stage of presenting each of our speakers with a small token as well. Go ahead. She'll come to you. You just go ahead. To Connie Vikni, to Dr. Shivakumar, and one to Bahar. Thank you very much. If I could request Mr. Sharp and Mr. Sharan to please join us for a photograph up on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause is usually useful in getting them to smile wider. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our policy dialogue discussion today. Please join us now for lunch outside. Do wear your masks. Thank you. Thank you. Outside, yes. Thank you very much.